Hello and good morning. My name is Letitia Grenier, and I'm the Resilient Landscapes Program Director at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and also the 2020 PPIC CalTrout Ecosystem Fellow. Thank you so much for being here today to join us to talk about the findings of our new report, Advancing Ecosystem Restoration with Smarter Permitting. I want to thank the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation and the funders of the PPIC CalTrout Ecosystem Fellowship for their support of this research and this event today. This is a really cool program and it's going to continue on. So look for what Sarah Knoll will be doing in the coming year about water for the environment. The report, as well as the slides from the presentation I'm going to give today, will be available on the PPIC website at ppic.org. And as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. So for our agenda today, I'm going to first present some of our key findings with a few slides, and then I'll invite our three experts to join me for our panel discussion. And these are the folks who've really been in the trenches making smarter permitting happen in California in a successful way. So it's going to be great to hear from them. I will ask them a few questions at first and we'll have a panel discussion, and then it'll be your turn. So please stay tuned so that you can ask your questions closer to the end of the event. And you can email them to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And if you would include your name and organization along with your question, that would be really great. And so with that, I'm going to begin our presentation. Just give me a second while I share the screen. All right, so this study was really thinking about what are the challenges that we're facing in our state today, and how can we help out with those challenges, thinking about environmental permitting. So if we look into the scientific literature and really the daily experience of our own lives, we can see that California's ecosystems and their functions, the things that they do for us and for wildlife, are impaired by the changes that have happened with water and land development, as well as challenges from climate change. So really important things that we need from the environment, like groundwater recharge or carbon sequestration, or not flooding where we don't want to flood, things like that. To achieve those things and to maintain what we already have, we need large-scale restoration of our ecosystems so that they function better, both for biodiversity and for these services they bring to people. And currently, the environmental permitting system that we have, it was built quite a while ago and structured quite a while ago when a lot of the laws were passed, especially in the 1970s. And so it wasn't designed to support restoration projects. That whole system was designed to limit harm from development projects, like putting in a parking lot or building a Walmart. And so the way that system is set up, it's actually now hindering the progress of restoration. We need to be doing restoration faster and bigger than we're able to do it right now. And permitting is one of the issues that's slowing things down. The Cutting the Green Tape initiative is beginning to address this need for reform in our state permitting system. And it's also, this is a key issue for hitting some of the recent state goals that have been proposed by the administration around 30 by 30 conservation and also climate resilience. So our approach to this question was to do some research by going out there and first understanding, okay, what is the issue with permitting? How is it hindering restoration projects? And what efforts have been out there to address this issue and improve the situation? And then we brought together experts who've been working on restoration and permitting to learn and discuss ideas. So essentially we said, let's focus on the successes and learn from them and find the lessons learned that cut across them and see if we can come up with some cross-cutting ideas for the future that could help advance these efforts. Some of those experts are with us today, so we're going to hear some great thoughts from them. We delved into many examples of permitting challenges, and I'm just going to give you details from a couple of large restoration projects that involve wetlands and aquatic areas. So the McCormick-Williamson Tract in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, it's a big tidal marsh and floodplain restoration project. It's been trying to get off the ground for more than a decade. And the Elk River Recovery Program, which is a really neat sort of systemically oriented restoration project that goes from up creek in a redwood area all the way down to the estuarine part of the river. And it has important services that it's going to provide, including supporting salmon, reducing flooding, and improving drinking water quality for the people who live there. And I know you probably can't read this table on the right, but what's going on there is a list of all the different regulatory requirements that each of these projects has. McCormick-Williamson, the X's for that project are the second to the right column, and the Elk River requirements are the X's on the far hand right column. And you can see that it's just a lot. It's really a lot of things. And of course, these kinds of projects don't have profit behind them the way a development project would to fund the effort that it takes to get through the permitting process. So by looking at these examples and many others, we were able to sort of put our heads around what the problem was. And what we heard from the experts is that permitting overly burdens restoration projects with extra time, cost, and complexity, that they're having a really hard time supporting that challenge, especially for some of the really big, complicated projects, which have a lot of potential to improve ecosystem function and bring us back those services that I talked about earlier that we all really need. And so we kind of flipped that around and defined smarter permitting as an approach to permitting that solves those problems. So smarter permitting takes less time, it costs less, it results in more acres permitted, so more restoration on the ground, and it leads to more functional restored ecosystems. So it leads to ecosystems that actually do their job better of supporting salmon or improving water quality or sequestering carbon or whatever the function of interest may be. And usually most of these ecosystems are providing a lot of different benefits to people and to wildlife. So we took care to look at case studies from across California as we were researching successful approaches to smarter permitting. And you can see that we did a pretty good job covering north to south. A lot of what we found was in aquatic and wetland ecosystems. And I think that's because these are both the most imperiled and modified ecosystems in California and also the most valuable. So that's where a lot of the attention has gone. And I mentioned this earlier this week. Looking at this map makes me think we should think maybe a little bit about the deserts and making sure that the desert washes and some of the ecosystems there are also being considered for these kinds of efforts. We also really tried to include diversity in terms of the different agencies that were helping with these smarter or leading these smarter permitting projects and the different other types of entities who were involved. So maybe it was water users or NGOs who were involved in helping them happen, really trying to look at the issue from all angles and learn about it. And I'm going to jump right to what we found. We found that there were, across all these case studies we looked at, there were 3 dimensions of smarter permitting. There were approaches that coordinated across similar projects. And I'm going to define these in more detail in just a minute. This is a lot of the programmatics fall under that category. There were approaches that were focused on coordinating within and among the agencies who require the regulatory hurdles be overcome. And then there was functional permitting, and that's a new term that we just coined, but it was about approaches that are focused on creating ecosystems that provide higher levels of those functions and services for people and for wildlife. So I'll go into more detail so you can understand what these 3 were. So first, coordinating across similar projects. These are often called programmatics, but I'm going to give an example of the HREA, and Erika can talk about it a little more later. But so it could be also an expedited process, not necessarily exactly a programmatic permit or approval. But these tend to apply to similar projects across a large area. So what you're doing is you're investing upfront to create a program that says, hey, permit applicants, here's the kind of thing that we would like to see you be proposing. And then if your project falls within that umbrella, you're going to have a much easier time going through the permitting process. And so it reduces the back and forth communication about permit requirements by sort of pre-aligning the projects with what the agencies want to see. And it steers those projects thus toward the agency goals. And I'm going to give the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act as a case study of this. And our expert today, Erika Lovejoy, can tell you a lot more about it later. It's an expedited approval process that simplifies the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's permitting process for voluntary restoration projects. And so that means lower fees, faster turnaround, and fewer related permits for the project proponent. And what we heard from the CDFW staff is it's also great for them because they see projects coming in that are the type of projects they would like. It also saves them staff time so that they can focus their time on other projects that need their attention. So this was really seen as a win-win by both project proponents and by the agency staff. And I'll give another example of a programmatic, which is the NIMF's programmatic biological opinions, and these have been growing across the state over time, as you can see in the graph at the bottom, starting in 2006. They're now in 4 different regions of the state. As of 2020, there's been over 200 projects approved through this programmatic. And what's really cool is that the folks at NIMFS actually tried to track how much money has this program saved, both in terms of agency staff time and in terms of the time or consultant fees that project proponents would have to pay to make permits happen. And they're seeing this on the order of about 10 million at this point. So these are really significant differences that can either allow agency staff to focus on something else that's really important, or can allow permittees to spend that money on the restoration itself. So going on to the second dimension of smarter permitting, it's coordinating within and among agencies. And the challenge here, as I showed you that, going back to that table about the McCormick-Williamson Tract and the Elk River Recovery Project, that restoration projects require approval from a lot of agencies typically, and they often don't have a lot of interagency coordination. So the permittee finds themselves sometimes getting conflicting agency requirements that takes a lot of back and forth for them to figure out how are they going to reconcile these things that the different agencies want. And the solution is that the agencies can coordinate with each other on the front end, and that can lessen this burden on the project proponents. And I'm going to give an example of an innovative approach that's been working on that, which is the BRIT, or the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. And these are a group of agencies that are necessary to approve tidal marsh restoration projects in San Francisco Bay. They got together, and I think it's important to know that they got extra resources so they could hire more staff. And those staff are pre-aligning using a pre-application process with the permittees to identify issues early and provide recommendations before the application goes through the formal permitting process. And so there's a benefit there in terms of pre-aligning and making a faster permit approval process is the goal. But also what we've heard is this can create a culture shift toward teamwork and collaboration. So now the agency staff are working more closely with the permittees from the start, and they're all working together as a team to get these projects approved. The BRIT is really new. It's growing right now, and it's gone through some early growing pains, but we're hoping that as time goes on and the projects that come into it are at the very beginning of their development in that pre-application phase, it will become even more successful and helpful. And moving on to the third dimension of smarter permitting, which is functional permitting. And again, this is focusing on achieving the desired ecosystem functions like supporting salmon or improving water quality. And what we found with this is that often the functional permitting is related to large and complex projects, which are important because they can deliver a lot of benefits in terms of restoration, but they're also sometimes hard to manage because people often want many different things coming out of these projects. And so one approach that has worked really well with functional permitting is to have trade-offs in different part of the ecosystem. So literally, I get what I want here and you get what you want over there. And that actually allows all the stakeholder needs to be met, or at least a good compromise to be achieved. And the system works better as a whole, because what we have to remember is ecosystems are large and the many parts actually fit together in terms of the way it functions. And I'll give an example from the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, where the permitting was not moving forward because there were concerns that if a lot of the managed ponds, which support migratory water birds, were restored to tidal marsh, which support endangered tidal marsh species, that there wouldn't be enough managed ponds left for the water birds. And the project was essentially at a deadlock. And what the solution was to say, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to use some science and track this over time and make sure that there are places where the water birds are taken care of and places where the tidal marsh birds are taken care of. We're going to have a stakeholder process where everyone is in the loop and we all see the monitoring data so that we feel comfortable and trust each other to move forward and start the process, even though we're not exactly sure what the exact balance of tidal marsh and managed pond will be at the end. And I think Heather can talk about another example of this later in the Santa Ana River. And these tend to be large-scale, multi-stakeholder, very inclusive processes. They require excellent leadership and often a strong science foundation to bring everyone along and create that culture of trust that's so important. And so the case study is the Upper Santa Ana River HCP, which again, Heather has been a leader of, and she will tell us more about. But to give you a quick overview, It's a highly urbanized watershed, and it had water supply challenges, like many places in California, especially Southern California, for both people and endangered wildlife. So this was one of those situations of figuring out, how do we use this water so there's enough for everybody? And the water users, one of the critical things that changed here was they really bought into the idea that ecosystem restoration did have to happen. So endangered fish populations had to get to a secure enough place that some take or some potential harm to those populations would be allowable under the Endangered Species Act. And so by buying into that, suddenly there was a coalition between the water users and the nonprofits or ecosystem restoration proponents of what to do and how to move this habitat conservation plan forward. And the way they did that is they actually move water around to trade off different functions in different parts of the watershed, which is really cool. And again, Heather can tell you more, but essentially this is things like, okay, I'm going to put water over here so that fish have enough where they need it. And somebody else is going to put water above my municipal wells so that I have the water where I need it. And there's a series of trades across the watershed that make that overall system function better so that there's at least the stakeholders are getting what they need in different areas. And so those are the three dimensions of smarter permitting that we saw as patterns across projects. We're recommending that the state and others really think about, are there ways to propagate this approach more widely? And lots of folks are working on this. I will just say it's a two-way street. This is not all on the agencies, nor is it all on the project proponents. This is a situation where teamwork and leadership needs to happen across the board, and probably more resources, more funding going toward the agencies to help them innovate and have the staff time to do some of the pre-alignment that we're talking about. So I'll just end with a few takeaways. This is sort of like, what we should do is enact these three dimensions of smarter permitting, but this is how we should do it. First of all, project proponents can initiate. Really, in almost every case, project proponents were the ones who were starting these initiatives, driving them forward, and partnering with the agencies to help make them happen. Second, we found that coordinating at the ecosystem scale can help reconcile multiple objectives. So it's complicated, and there's a lot of process to coordinating at that large spatial scale, but there can be really big benefits, especially for ecosystems or areas where there's kind of a deadlock between the many needs or management goals. Third, an inclusive process really helps resolve management conflicts. So, what we need to do is bring all stakeholders to the table. And I didn't go into a lot earlier, but we really also need to be thinking about environmental justice and bringing in frontline communities, communities of color, perhaps people who haven't been as well represented in some of these stakeholder groups in the past. Fourth, early alignment is a wise investment. One of the things we saw across these different initiatives and what we heard from the experts is that if you put in that effort at the front end, it really saves you time and money across the rest of the process of developing the project and permitting it. And then finally, a culture of trust allows flexibility and change. To make progress here, we are going to need to see change, and that involves everybody, as I said before, getting on board, developing trust with each other to be willing to do things a little bit differently. And I think we can look to leaders across all of the different organizations to create incentives, to find ways to build that trust, to help provide resources and money to support these processes so that we can make this progress and try to really increase the pace and scale of our restoration to meet the needs of Californians and our wildlife. And with that, I will turn this over to the panel discussions, and I'll remind you to please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. All right, so I'm going to start bringing the panelists up onto video. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to do a long introduction for each of these folks, but trust me, they're innovators and leaders in this area. But you can check out their bios on the PPIC event page. Hi, Heather. This is Heather Dyer, the CEO and General Manager of the San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District. And next, Xavier is coming online. Good morning, Xavier. This is Xavier Fernandez, the Planning Manager at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. And last, we have Erika Lovejoy, the Program Director of Accelerating Restoration at Sustainable Conservation. Thank you so much for being here today, everybody. I'm really glad to see you. And I have a missing question. So I think it was Erika. While I bring that up, I think I was going to ask you first. Can you tell us a little bit more about the coordinating across similar projects approach?
For myself, I think you wanted to talk about programmatic permits and expedited approval processes and some examples around that. So I'm just going to kind of shift gears that direction. And what it means ultimately for improvements to the environment. And so we've been working for about the past 20 years with agencies in the legislature to develop policy and regulatory incentives to help make it easier to get important habitat restoration work done. And a great example of a successful program around this is with NOAA and the California Coastal Commission, because we help them to develop programmatic permits, which you talked about briefly, which are pre-written permits to cover a wide variety of high priority aquatic habitat restoration project types. And we help them with programmatic permits that cover projects within both of their jurisdictions. And NOAA has covered, as you mentioned, more than 200 projects, and they are getting projects done in the coastal areas where, frankly, a lot of work didn't happen before because things were really taking quite a long time. And the program has saved millions of dollars as well as a significant amount of private funds. And that means more money has been available for on-the-ground work. And the permits have been an excellent planning tool, because they've standardized protection measures. The conditions were coordinated between these agencies. It's created a lot more regulatory certainty. And NOAA has estimated that they have reduced their administrative review time by more than 75%, which is really substantial because they're not having to write a new permit every single time. And that has really helped project proponents get to implementation a lot sooner. And then the other successful example of efficient permitting that Letitia touched upon is the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act, or HRE Act for short, which is legislation that Sustainable Conservation sponsored back in 2014 and creates a 30 to 60 day permitting process with California Department of Fish and Wildlife for small restoration projects. And they just permitted their 100th project under this excellent program. And it's coordinated. The program's coordinated with a state water board permit that's already in place for small projects. And that's really helped to simplify the paperwork, avoid duplication of effort. And then it covers 2 different DFW permits and 1 authorization without raising fees. And that's definitely an incentive to get more restoration work done. And we've heard from surveys of project proponents that they've been able to get projects implemented a year sooner than under the normal permitting scheme. And then to the ultimate goal here, in terms of ecological benefits, there's been a number of beneficial projects with both programs that help species adapt to climate change, expand vegetated ecosystems to sequester carbon, improve water quality, recharge groundwater, reduce flooding. They've removed barriers to fish passage, restored wetlands, estuaries, and floodplains. It's really been a wide variety of projects that have been accomplished through these programs. And it's our goal that we would expand this effort to all of the state and federal agencies. And we're currently working with the State Water Board and Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps to expand that NOAA model with some progressive permitting efforts with them as well.
That is so great to hear all those details. Thank you so much, Erika. We can see how the efficiency is really helping more good things happen on the ground. And I want to turn now to you, Xavier. Oftentimes when we go out and talk to folks about coordinating permitting at the ecosystem scale or the watershed scale, we hear that it's too difficult and big. And I know the Water Board has been working on the dredge and fill procedures that are taking an approach of actually using that as part of the permitting process. Can you give an example of where this has been successful and improved the outcome for actually making a more functional ecosystem?
Yes, the Water Board's been the Regional Water Board has been using a watershed approach for quite some time, over 20 years. And one of the best examples is the Napa River watershed restoration projects. And in 1999, we started with a flood control project in the city of Napa. and that we were able to work together and coordinate internally, because there was a lot of actually cleanup that needed to be done on the floodplain, where there's a lot of old industrial sites with contamination. So we internally coordinated with between divisions within my agency, but also we coordinated with the Army Corps and with stakeholders and other regulatory agencies to get the Corps to see that the standard flood control project was not the best project for this area. Because of that, they were able to get a living river project. The industrial sites were all cleaned up. They have a floodplain that provides resilience to sea level rise, because it is in a tidal reach. And then in 2009, we wrote a total maximum daily load. So what that is it's a water quality improvement plan for the watershed. And we wrote it for sediment. Through that action in 2009, we've restored 15 miles of Napa River through grants, as well as working with vineyard owners to actually give up land in order to allow the river to have the space it needs to migrate around. And what the vineyard owners found out is that this actually helps them control the glasswing, which is an insect that actually impacts the grapes. And by having this riparian corridor around the river, that provides a buffer and helps to keep the glasswing from impacting their grapes. So there's a benefit from them for that. And this was all done through this sediment total maximum daily load, as well as the work that we were doing before. And the last thing I'll mention is you can't forget too about the uplands that surround the waters. And so we actually issued a permit for vineyards in order to control the sediment that is coming off of those properties, because the restoration actions that we put in place, that we spent a lot of grant money funding and getting permitting. We had to coordinate with all of the agencies that you saw there, and we worked with project proponents to do that. But those restoration efforts, quite frankly, would not have been very successful if sediment was still coming off the land from the vineyard, and those fine sediments were going to get into the cobble and the gravels that are used for salmonids to spawn. So it really took a big picture view in order to maximize the benefits of those restoration actions.
That is a fantastic example, Javier. Thank you so much. I think I really appreciate hearing how the upland is related to the river, and you need to get the whole system functioning well together. And also it's great that it was a win-win for the landowners as well. Another example of having a functional ecosystem actually gives you more lift or more benefits overall. And now I want to turn to you, Heather. You've been successful at dealing with some challenging water use and permitting situations. So what I'd love to hear from you is, what does it take to create a culture of trust where traditionally opposed stakeholders, like say water users and endangered species advocates, are willing to find a permitting solution together?
Thanks, Letitia. So I think it's exactly what Javier just said. You have to be able to demonstrate the benefits to the different stakeholders beyond what they had probably originally conceived. So if you think about it, the water agencies, perhaps instinctually you think, I don't want more endangered fish in the river. I want them all to die out so I don't have to deal with this anymore. But in reality, functional extinction is a very, very long process that will not behoove you. And so the easier way to make your job more streamlined in the future is actually helping to promote the recovery of that species, so that there are then many, let's say it's an endangered bird. So, there's more of that bird around. And when you go to get permits for your actions, it's easier to get that permit. And so that's a very different way of looking at the endangered species situations that we have in California. Water agencies, vineyards, other stakeholders, flood control, going and saying, how can I promote recovery of these species. And even to take it out a next step, like Xavier was saying about the uplands, how do I promote recovery of watershed health? Because that's really what we're talking about, right? We've had many, many decades of changes to these systems. And so in the Napa River example, that system had changed such there's not the insectivore species that can take care of bugs that then damage the grapes. But if you can take it back to a more functional system, there are many, many benefits to be had. And so I think that's really the first place that you start, is you get all the different stakeholders around the table and say, what do you need to achieve to accomplish your mission? And that includes regulators, NGOs, flood control districts, water agencies, cities, educational communities, all of those things. And it's like a giant puzzle that you try to figure out how to meet as many of those needs as possible and try to find as many benefits for as many partners and find ways that you can build off of each other. So, a flood control project that improves flood control but promotes ecosystem health and recovery, that's a win-win. Like, that is a no-brainer for all the entities sitting around the table. They say, of course, everything will be easier in the future if we have a more functional system in terms of getting permits. Because when you start from a very, very impaired baseline, which many of our systems are now, our regulatory partners, and I do think of them as partners at the regional board, the Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife agencies, it's harder for them to do their job in terms of issuing you a permit for your project. So it really needs to be sitting around the table and looking for those win-wins and building off of each other and designing projects for multiple benefits intentionally. And I think that's the most important thing about, trust, is that it starts small, but you prove yourself to each other over time by being respectful, by being forthright. Not everything will work for everyone. You have to be able to say, that's just not going to work for me because of whatever, your issue might be. I'm a water agency, so there's some situations where I just can't put more water down this particular stream. I don't have any more, or I need to serve my municipal customers, but maybe there's someone else out there who can. And so that's what it's all about, is that complex problem solving in a culture of trust and respect for everyone's missions.
A wonderful answer. Thank you. I have to say, every time I hear you guys, all three of you talk, I feel so inspired. So there it is, right from the people who have done this. Creative problem solving can crack this nut. And a lot of the reason that it can is that the ecosystems that we're trying to restore are really valuable. And so the benefits that they bring back from being restored can help bring people on board and make win-win situations. So now we're going to turn a little bit more toward the future and think about recommendations in terms of what should people be thinking about and doing as we try to propagate some of the lessons learned from this report out into future projects. So I'm going to start with Xavier. You've both worked inside and outside of regulatory agencies on wetland restoration. So I think you know both sides of this coin. What can both regulatory agencies and project proponents do to develop better partnerships?
I think a key term, and I heard it from Heather, and I just heard it from you, is to think of each other as partners rather than different entities working for different organizations. If we think of each other as partners, then we can start to build that trust and communicate effectively, where we are listening to each other and not just listening to make sure that our position is held, but listen so that we understand the needs of each other so that we can work out a solution collectively and collaboratively. And a good example of this came with Pine Gulch restoration project that was actually stuck for 10 years. And then we got involved, the water board a little more. We were willing to permit it, but it was stuck with another agency. And so we actually served as kind of like I'll call it a translator. So we were able to translate what the project proponents and what some other agencies, fisheries agencies, what they wanted and what through their lens to another agency. And at the same time, we were able to translate from this other agency their concerns to the project proponents and supporters. And through that mechanism, we were able to sort of break down the barriers and build a little trust and also get them to understand each other so that they could focus on solutions rather than entrenched positions.
I think those are really great points. And we're hearing this now coming up as a sort of repeated theme that we need to have good communication. This is not lip service partnership. This is real partnership where we're listening and being concerned about the needs of the other partners so that we can find that solution or compromise that works. And it makes me think that, you know, it takes time. Maybe people need to work together over time, you know, as groups so that they can understand each other, because it can be very complicated trying to understand what is required under the different legislation that we have out there. Heather, I'm going to go to you next. What would we like to see from state and agency leaders? So coming from the top down side now, what could they do to support smarter permitting in terms of both structure and funding?
One thing that I would love to see is a more coordinated effort to look at watershed recovery as a whole. So multi-stakeholder, multi-agency processes where it's, you know, many scientists from all the different fields. So, you know, in reality, most of our systems are impaired. Some of them are highly impaired. And the status quo is not working. So in most of our river systems or, you know, alluvial systems or salt marsh systems, there's some level of impairment that we should concentrate on recovering function. And so if you get all those scientists together and the stakeholders, and you really think about like, what values are we looking for here? And you can expand your idea of what is, like Xavier said, you know, not what one agency needs, but as a watershed or a system, what do we need in order to promote the functional processes and the long-term resilience of those systems? Then it blows up into a much larger conversation about, okay, how is the hydrology? How is the sediment transport? How is the vegetation functioning? Do we have a lot of endangered species? What are the threats coming our way? I mean, we haven't even talked about the threats of climate change and different impacts to these systems. So it's looking at what does a healthy, resilient system look like in two decades? And what are the steps that we need to take to get there? And the important thing to remember is that these systems do have value. And so if the status quo is not acceptable and we know there's greater value out there, how do we harness the power of those values? So for instance, I'm thinking of, you know, watersheds, urban watershed systems like the Santa Ana River. That might be the only nature that a lot of the kids within our region ever see. So what is the ecosystem service value of a functional river system for our communities? Suddenly that's a much different conversation than these fish biologists want to, you know, restore a small urban stream fed by runoff. What are they thinking? That's not worth it. You know, if you look at the functional system as a whole, it changes the conversation to why do we want to invest in recovery of this system? And if you can do that over time with many voices, I think that's really where we want to head in terms of as a state. What do we want to see on the ground in our state over time? And that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's hard. But I think that's the direction we need to go if we do want to have functional natural spaces in this state in the future.
That's so helpful. And I just want to bounce off your point about access to nature. I think we've all become so much more aware of how important it is to have outdoor places and biodiverse, beautiful, you know, full of nature outdoor places to be especially when we're so locked up. And it's an environmental justice issue. There's a lot of research that shows that being in nature is good for us physically and mentally, and everybody should have access to that, even in highly urbanized areas. So thanks so much for adding that point in. And last, I'm going to turn back to Erika. How can elected and agency leaders support cultural change within agencies toward restoration permitting? You've worked quite a lot with these agencies and been really successful, so I'm curious to hear from you about that.
Well, thank you for asking me this extremely tough question. For those of you who don't know, I worked as an agency staffer and a regulator for many, many years, including at the regional boards, among other agencies. And this is a really tough question because agency staff are people who really care deeply about natural resources. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do their jobs. They're charged with implementing the law, and they have to work within the current regulatory framework that they have. And so, as you mentioned earlier, that system is really designed for regulating development and not for efficiently restoring the environment. And we'd really like to see restoration be on a separate permitting track than development. So those projects can be viewed from a different lens, and we can create the partnership approach that Heather and Xavier referred to. So yes, we need to come up with new ways to make it easier for agencies and project proponents to team up. And the agency heads need to be willing to do things a little bit differently and put some new systems in place. And even though one size doesn't fit all, for sure, a lot of folks are thinking about this. Some things that we think could be done to support agency staff to improve the system would be, first, all of the agency leaders could help to ensure that they have efficient permitting tools in place to benefit agencies and project proponents, and tools that are dedicated for restoration, put those projects on a separate track, and that can really empower staff to advance restoration projects. And then, of course, it's going to take a lot more than just efficient permitting to get restoration work done. At many of the agencies, the way things are set up, the staff functions around permitting, funding restoration, technical assistance, they can be very fragmented and spread out. And sometimes the teams don't necessarily have a common mission or direction. And the most successful programs that we have seen put technical assistance, funding, and permitting all in the same house. And that really helps to clarify a common mission and make it easier and more efficient for staff to partner with restoration project proponents. So for example, California Fish and Wildlife and NOAA have grant programs that provide technical assistance and help with permitting. And by putting all these essential services in one package, they really have great partnerships and get a lot done. Next, it would be really helpful if the legislature could come up with ways to reduce agency reliance on permit fees to fund staff. And this is a kind of a controversial issue, but this really creates an inherent conflict where agency staff are in a position where they have to maximize fees, and the high fees can be a real disincentive for restoration. And as part of the last budget cycle, the legislature and the administration secured additional short-term agency funding as part of the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, which is absolutely great. But it would be really helpful if they could identify long-term funding to keep fees low and really make sure that staff are adequately funded so they could maximize these really important programs. And then a final comment on this is that organizational change can take a really long time. I think we know that. And agencies have a lot of competing pressures, and it can be really hard to put all these new tools in place. So over time, policymakers are really going to need to evaluate where we're at in the overall effort to create regulatory efficiencies for restoration, and take a look at what additional tools or actions might be needed to really facilitate progress so we can, accelerate restoration at the pace and scale that we need to do.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much. Yeah, it seems like getting some legislative directives and increased funding would really help the agencies make progress. And we did hear from the agencies recently that there's a lot of political will to make these changes. So thank you so much for those comments, Erika. That's fantastic. And not only is this panel amazing, and I love all the answers you've given, but you guys are on time. I didn't have to do anything. So thank you so much. We are going to go ahead and switch over now to answering questions from our audience, and I will relay the questions toward you all. As a reminder to everybody who's watching, the address is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. There it is on the screen. Okay, so let me turn to the questions I've got coming in. This is from Shannon Swanson, who's a legislative aide to Assemblywoman, oh, I'm going to say this wrong. I hope I apologize if I pronounce this wrong, Kadi Petrie Norris. She's working for a member who wants to make permitting easier in California. What is the best place to start for researching and identifying opportunities to author legislation in this space? So taking what's coming out of our report and turning it into, really specific advice for legislators. Does anyone want to take that question? Is there something to read or a place to go for that?
I'll give that one a whirl. I will say that there's definitely a lot of opportunities. I think it's going to be really important to talk to the folks who have been working in this space, including sustainable conservation, as well as the folks at the Landscape Stewardship Network, who helped to start the whole Cutting the Green Tape effort, the folks at the Resources Agency, Secretary Crowfoot and Jennifer Norris, who head that effort and support that effort, because a lot of work has already been done. And I know there's been tremendous goodwill and intent, which is very much appreciated, but the policies are so complicated, as well as the programs, and there's a number of initiatives underway. So it's important to make sure it's an additive benefit for whatever's developed.
Absolutely.
Appreciate the legislators' effort.
Agreed. It's so fantastic to have attention on this topic. Heather or Javier, did you want to add to that?
I like to promote just a common sense approach. I know it's really hard to change these policies, but there are some policies that are not supportive of restoration occurring. So I can think, the most immediate example, and I'm a former regulator, so I get it. I don't want people to think that I'm anti-mitigation, but when you're trying to do a restoration project, and let's say it's a function that's been the function has been impaired for many, many years. You're trying to restore a stream, for example. If the function has not been there, and let's say it's created a small wetland because the stream wasn't working right, and you're trying to restore a stream, and then you have to mitigate for impacts to a wetland that shouldn't be there in the first place, it's painful as the project proponent, because that is very hard to justify. I'm using water agency money to restore streams. It's hard to justify to our elected officials, why are we mitigating for a project that's supposed to be doing good, So things like that just don't necessarily make sense. Like, there has to be a solution out there. I don't know exactly what it is, but thinking through like things that feel punitive when you're trying to do restoration, how can we find common sense solutions so that that's not happening? Because it is a deterrent. And those kinds of things can only be changed through policy or legislation. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer, but that is a major obstacle that I can see that policy and legislators could work on.
Yeah, we've heard that one over and over again from restoration projects. They're already trying to fix something, and then they have to mitigate for the impacts of trying to fix that thing.
Yeah.
So I can't really comment to the legislation part because my agency cannot lobby legislators, so I want to stay clear of that. However, there is a difference between legislation and regulation, and many policies are regulation and not legislation. And to the point of mitigation, right now we are working on a policy, more clarifications than a change in policy, but we want to provide a roadmap for type change, which is what Heather was talking about when you're converting one type to another, and just the factors and considerations that need to be taken in order to evaluate whether that trade-off is appropriate, and that we think is, we've worked with other agencies to start crafting it, and we're trying to refine it through the Bay Regulatory Restoration Integration Team, the BRIT, to help refine those sort of type change, because it has to be scaled up and down. That's the tricky part, because you can't put like onerous requirements for a bunch of information on projects that are pretty small versus really large projects, and it's challenging coming up with these policy fixes, but we are working on it.
It's great to hear that that's happening, Javier. That will be a real innovation. And I guess what I would say back to this question is that what we've heard that really, the agencies want from the legislators is more money. And there's been examples of successes when the agencies have more resources or money to have more staff, they can do a lot more pre-alignment, they can do some of these incubator projects that start to figure out new ways to develop successful permitting approaches. And the other thing that might be helpful is a legislative directive that said, hey, agencies, we do want you to focus on restoration permitting as something very important. So kind of helping the agency leadership see where the priorities are and then giving them the money to be able to move toward those priorities. We've heard from other folks in this space previously. All right, I want to move on to the next question. Excuse me. This is from, I'm just going to apologize to everybody for pronouncing your names wrong, from Wolfgang Rubel of the Butte County Resource Conservation District. He was asking about the example of trade-offs between tidal marsh and managed ponds that was resolved through science and monitoring. How long did that take to achieve a consensus? And that's a great question. I want to say a couple of years of negotiation, but the real thing that they did was rather than wait for all the science and monitoring to happen, they agreed on an adaptive management plan. So they said, we're not going to wait 5 years to monitor all these populations, and for marshes to restore takes a long time, and then the birds have to move in. What they said was, we're going to set up a robust adaptive management plan with science. All the stakeholders are going to be at the table. Everybody's going to get to weigh in, and all of you will have some power in the decision making before we convert so much of this landscape to tidal marsh that the water birds might lose out. And they're actually now approaching, someday soon, they will approach a 50-50 tidal marsh managed pond landscape. So there's still plenty of time to monitor and think about making sure that all of the stakeholders and species are being served by that future landscape. So these processes take so long that there's really no need to wait for the science, but it can help build trust and a common basis of knowledge to set up the science and get it going. So sorry, I answered that one because
Letitia, Letitia, can I add a little something to that?
Please, please.
You also have to put the 2 years in context. This is the largest restoration project on the West Coast. Literally thousands of acres we're talking about. So, 2 years when you're talking about trade-offs over thousands of acres is actually not that long for how big that project is. Now, if it was a couple hundred acres, maybe 2 years is a bit long. So, you have to put it in context.
That's a great point, Javier. And the amount of thousands of acres of restoration happened pretty much immediately after they got this going. Very fast, very rapid restoration, really important for that to happen before sea level rise got going. So it's a great example of putting in that early investment and then seeing a payoff. And it's a 50-year project. So it's a great point that 2 years is not that much out of a 50-year project. Yeah,
Letitia, on this question, I'd just also like to add, this is a really good place, I think, for where it becomes evident about what if it's a watershed, but whatever your system is, that system recovery, what does that look like? Because when you start talking about trade-offs, the larger the scale that you're looking at, then you can start saying, okay, well, yeah, maybe we lose a little bit of habitat down here in this area, but on the larger scale, it's made up for because the whole system is improved. There's more habitat over in this other area. And so it starts to make a lot more sense. Whereas if you're just looking at a very small area, maybe the trade-offs don't make as much sense because you don't have all the other values incorporated.
Thank you so much for that point, Heather. I think that's a great example of how using that larger spatial scale helps you deal with the type conversion issues and essentially making everybody whole over the long term. And that's going to require maybe more flexible interpretation of policy, like Javier was talking about, they've been working on. I'm going to take this question from Robert Martin. I'm not sure if anyone here can answer it or not. He's at the SSL law firm, and he'd be interested to hear about any reform efforts and suggestions related to permitting obstacles in the court, like CEQA. So maybe less focused on the permits and more on the processes.
The age-old question of how to make CEQA better.
Yeah, I think I could just talk about in general efficiencies, agency efficiencies around CEQA, as opposed to litigation. We want to avoid litigation, right? That's the thing. And there can be many efficiencies around CEQA with the development of programmatic CEQA documents. In fact, the state water board's developing a programmatic CEQA document for their draft restoration general order that they are considering right now. And that's going to be very useful. CAL FIRE developed a statewide vegetation management CEQA document. It's been already shown tremendous utility. And so basically thinking about what are the high priority projects that you need to do over a period of time, and trying to do at least a general analysis of them all, so then you can build off of that baseline CEQA document. And that can really save a tremendous amount of time and money. Definitely helps the agencies because they have to meet that CEQA mandate. They are responsible for that. And so that's a progressive approach. There's also a number of recommendations around CEQA clarifications and improvements that have been part of the Cutting the Green Tape recommendations. And that's something that Secretary Crowfoot is considering with his agency right now.
I would add that another, really important part of all of this is that interagency coordination, even before you do your CEQA document, because if you can really understand the needs of especially the responsible agencies, like what do you need to see in this CEQA document in order to be able to use it to issue permits? If you have federally endangered species, what kind of conservation measures are you going to need to get my federal permits so that I can make sure I have all of that stuff in my CEQA document so that it's covered? And so kind of getting all the regulatory agencies around the same table and say, this is what I'm trying to do. What do each of you need in order to issue me my permits, and make sure that that is incorporated into your CEQA document ahead of time so that you don't have to keep going back and revising, or even worse, if a responsible agency can't use your CEQA document, like nothing stalls a project like an agency having to write their own CEQA.
Yeah, and Heather, if I could just add, the State Water Board, we're providing technical assistance to them and have helped get some of the input from other agencies, some of the federal agencies who are working on other efforts. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife has contributed a lot of great input to the State Water Board's document. And so it's just really helped to integrate a lot of the concerns of the different agencies, exactly for the reason you just stated.
Thanks for those great answers. We have time for one question. We're going to have to answer it fairly quickly because we're just about out of time. This is from Krista Herader. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong, at Sustainable Conservation. And I think this is a really good question because it's about drought, and it's something we're all thinking about right now. What's the most urgent thing we could do in California to advance restoration right now because of drought?
I think thinking at a watershed scale about long-term recovery of systems.
Yeah, making them resilient. Sorry, go ahead, Javier.
No, that's right. Thinking on watershed scale, which actually means looking at the uplands in ways that we can conserve water through water recapture, similar to like what they do in Australia, where all new development is required to have water tanks that are connected to the downspouts and things like that in order to maintain the water. Because one of the biggest impacts that we see is a lot of curtailment of flow releases from dams because there isn't enough water to go around. And so the fish get hammered because there's no water. So the more we can conserve in upland areas and in residential areas through water recapture, changing landscape practices, the more water that will be available for everyone.
Yeah, and improving those habitats as well, so there's more natural recharge to the systems and the hydrology is restored. So I fully agree with Heather and Javier, and to help it along, getting all that efficient permitting in place to move the projects forward, and be able to allow the agencies to think more expansively to move it along.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. This was a great discussion. We've talked before, but I learn a lot every time, and I really appreciate you all being here. We are out of time. Thanks again to our panelists and to our funders, and finally to all of the audience. Thanks so much for your great questions and your attention and your interest in this work. If you pre-registered for this event, you'll receive a survey. And I know PPIC would really appreciate it if you could take just a couple minutes to respond and let us know how you did so we can keep making future events better. And everyone, take care of yourselves, be safe, and have a great day.